This is a Brain Ponderings podcast. I'm your host, Mark Matson. Sit back and enjoy as my guests and I take a deep dive into the brain in health and disease. So in this episode of Brain Ponderings, I'm going to talk with my friend, neuroendocrinologist and behavioral anthropologist, Robert Sapolsky. He's at Stanford University, where he's the John and Cynthia Fry Gunn Professor. His main appointment is in the Biological Sciences Department, but he has joint appointments in neurology and other departments there. Robert, he got his bachelor's degree at Harvard in behavioral anthropology. And then he had interesting experiences during his gap years, which he can tell us about before he went on for his PhD. So Robert is perhaps best known from the lay public for his outstanding lectures at Stanford. And I guess he's one of the most, if not the most popular teacher at Stanford. I've watched several of his lectures for his classes there, which are fantastic. He has a gift for communicating science to the public. And before we get into his research findings on stress and how the brain and body in an interactive way respond to stress in both meaningful situations and, unfortunately, with chronic uncontrollable stress, this can lead to disease. So, Robert, is this a gift you have for communication, or did you have to develop that by practicing?
I think, well, a certain amount of practicing. I think what it turns out, and apologies that I keep glancing to the left here, I'm feeding kibble to a dog here in the hopes of keeping him nice and calm and quiet throughout. So I can't guarantee that will be successful. I think it turns out, and thank you for saying those nice things. I think it has to do with the fact that I turn out to have a remarkable ability to tell when people in an audience are beginning to get bored out of their minds and glazed over, so that it's time to do something to change the tempo of things. I can detect when students' heads suddenly tilt back because they're asleep, and I can look up their nostrils and things like that. So I think that's probably the key to my success.
Yeah, the first lecture I ever saw you give was when you got the Young Investigator of the Year award for the Society for Neuroscience. And you gave a lecture there for that. And it's quite striking compared to other scientists who, I guess, aren't able to make eye contact and kind of read the minds, if you will, of the audience, and kind of, you can tell someone isn't following you, then back up a little bit, explain it a different way, and that kind of thing. Okay, so let's talk about what you did in the few years following your undergraduate work at Harvard.
Well, I've spent a long time being very confused as to sort of what I am, whether I'm a neuroscientist or a primatologist, and I was royally confused all throughout college with this, and managed in the years since to do both with incredible amounts of fortune. Right after college, within a week of graduation, I went off and spent a year studying a population of baboons in the Serengeti in East Africa, and liked it enough that I developed this annual rhythm of spending 3-4 months a year there, the rest of the time in the lab, and did that for 33 years. So that place and the baboons became sort of a second home and family. It was the same population of baboons. I pitched my tent under the same tree for about a decade and a half. And the basic thing I was looking at there was what social behavior has to do with who's got the lousy blood pressure and elevated cholesterol levels, and what does social rank and social affiliation have to do with who gets the stress-related diseases. So it was, unfortunately, I had to stop about a decade ago, but it was heaven getting to spend a big chunk of each year just out in a national park in East Africa.
And at some point, this wasn't just you alone. You had students go there with you. Is that right?
Well, actually, I never did.
Oh, you didn't?
No, I managed not to, because it became sort of, as you know this painfully as well, that as you start building a lab, suddenly what you're mostly doing is writing grants or balancing budgets or dealing with postdocs who are having anxiety attacks and things of that sort. So I never had any students or postdocs out there, because it was the last place where I could
I see.
do every experiment. I did every blood draw. I did every darting. So it was the last place I could be a grad student for 3 decades.
That's amazing. And looking back in PubMed, your first published article was a single author article, and this was before you went to graduate school. Is that true?
I think I attempted to get it published around then. It took a few more years because I was completely unable to write coherently at the time. But yeah, so I've done.
But anyway, the point is, this was you on your own.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Well, it was a lifelong dream, and I was incredibly lucky, mainly most along the lines that in grad school, Rockefeller University, my advisor, Bruce McEwen, who was one of the giants of stress research and like a lifelong father figure for me, who unfortunately died 2 years ago. But it turned out he was perfectly fine with my disappearing from the lab 3-4 months a year. So the fact that he was okay with this kind of oscillating pattern allowed me to start doing this. So that was one of the many gifts he gave me.
And what would you say were your main findings from your studies in the baboons?
I guess it was 3. The first one was, if you have a choice in the matter, you want to be a high-ranking male baboon. Baboons, they live in these big social troops, 50, 100 animals. They have very fluid dominance among males. They've got complex coalitions. They spend an incredible amount of time scheming and stabbing each other in the back. And they're all about social stress, much like us. There's very few baboons out there who get ulcers because leopards are hassling them every day. It's because other baboons are hassling them every day. So they're great models for us. So what seemed to be the case was, you look across the dominance hierarchy and it's the lowest ranking guys who were the least healthy. Stress hormone levels elevated, immune systems that didn't work that well, that sort of thing. So I guess that was the first finding. The second finding is, it turned out I had wasted my first 20 years out there, because that first finding turned out to be nowhere near as interesting as I thought. And the third finding was, if you got a choice between being a high-ranking male baboon, and you want to have a healthy body and avoid stress-related diseases, between being a high-ranking baboon or a socially affiliated baboon, go for the social affiliation every time. Once I started being able to study a baboon equivalent of like friendship and social support, and those are not silly anthropomorphic terms, once sort of focusing on that, turned out that was much more interesting stuff than like who gets to eat the dead gazelle first.
And your first book was Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, is that right? And
No,
is that
actually, no. And
no?
you actually just proved the point, which was the first book, which was a neurology monograph on
Oh,
neuron death and the aging brain.
oh,
And it was read by about 3.5 people, and 3 of them hated it and that completely disappeared. But the first book I've written for non-scientists was called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers.
yeah, and that yeah, and so viewers and listeners to this podcast can consult that for a lot of nice stories uh, on, on your studies and your take on social rank and proneness to the adverse effects of stress. And then you've also been interested in violence. These
Well,
these baboons, they are prone to violence occasionally, right?
yeah, they're kind of awful. They have actually the highest rate of violence of any non-human primate. Your average male baboon dies from a male baboon, either killed in a fight or injured enough so the hyenas pick him off, or he goes septic or something. They spend an amazing amount of time being aggressive with each other. But it turns out they spend even more time not being aggressive, but in effect threatening to be aggressive. Psychological bluff, intimidation, forming a coalition that's stable enough that nobody's going to mess with you. And much of the time, it's the deterrence that they're really into. So interesting in that regard. And as it turns out, sort of the intertwining of baboons being awful to each other and baboons being very, very stressed. Being stressed by other baboons being awful to each other, and dealing with your own stress by being awful to some other baboon you can get away with, tells us a lot about the human condition.
Now in the baboons, there's some limitations to what you could do in the baboons in terms of trying to understand how the neuroendocrine stress pathways affect the brain. Could you just summarize the neuroendocrine stress pathway from the brain, hypothalamus, adrenal gland?
Well, this is the endocrine pathway that I've been obsessed over for most of my life. The endpoint, everybody knows, like, what's the most important hormone out there during stress? It's adrenaline. It's being released from your adrenal glands within seconds of the onset of stress. It's making your stomach clench, all of that. Turns out there's an even more important hormone, although all sorts of people in the adrenaline field would have apoplexy over that, but I think it's much more important. Another class of hormones that come out of the adrenal glands called glucocorticoids, human version, cortisol, also known as hydrocortisone. There's all sorts of synthetic versions like dexamethasone, prednisone and stuff, which should feel kind of familiar to a bunch of people out there. In my view, adrenaline gets your foothold on the beachhead for dealing with stress. Glucocorticoids is what grinds you forward from there in terms of like the stress response. So something stressful happens and your brain realizes it because you're hemorrhaging from a lion, or because you're wondering about global warming or something psychological. And as he said, all of that gets transduced into a signal down to the hypothalamus base of the brain, which releases a hormone that travels like a few fractions of an inch to the pituitary, which releases a hormone, which then travels through the bloodstream. And within a couple of minutes, your adrenals are beginning to secrete glucocorticoids. So it's this perfect axis, the jargon, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, by which tumult going on in your head within a couple of minutes is changing your entire body and every single one of its outposts.
And at Rockefeller in your PhD work, you started focusing on what does cortisol do to the neurons in the brain.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, basically the whole thing, once again, decades of life, could be summarized as they do bad stuff. They do awful stuff to the brain. And to appreciate it, you've got to sort of appreciate first this basic dichotomy in the whole field. If you were like a normal mammal, if you are a bird, if you're an amphibian, if you were a reptile, you secrete glucocorticoids. You secrete the same exact molecules thanks to the same hypothalamus, pituitary, etc. Glucocorticoids are 100 million years old. Somewhere back when, before the comet, some dinosaur was being pursued by another one, and it was secreting the exact same molecules that like we do now during stress. So it's incredibly ancient stuff. And if you're your basic vertebrate, you're being stressed because somebody's trying to eat you, or you're trying to eat somebody else, or a short-term physical crisis. And what glucocorticoids do during the stress response is brilliant if you're trying to avoid a predator or be a successful one yourself. They increase blood pressure, they mobilize energy, they shut off all the unessential things in your body like digestion and growth and sex and reproduction, you know, the logic being, you know, hit puberty tonight, don't waste energy on it right now, if hopefully there is it tonight. It just triages everything. And short term in the brain, what it makes you do is think more clearly, and your sensory thresholds are more acute, and you get that tunnel visionness where all you're thinking about is the lion chasing you or your thesis committee that's quizzing you. And all of that's great for dealing with short-term stress. And then you get to be a psychosocially sophisticated primate like us or a baboon, and you could spend all your time being stressed psychologically, and thus secreting glucocorticoids 24/7 for purely psychological reasons. And you're secreting this hormone where what it does is it just increases your blood pressure, and you're delivering glucose to your thigh muscles. And that's happening because you're sitting in a traffic jam like every single morning, or you're thinking about taxes a month from now or some such thing. You're secreting glucocorticoids for all of the wrong reasons, and reasons that like 99% of the beasts out there could make no sense of whatsoever. You're sitting there and you're being stressed by a scary movie. Like, they're pixels, they're not real creatures, and they're not creatures who are going to attack you, yet nonetheless you secrete the exact same thing. And the punchline of the whole field is, you know, activate glucocorticoids, this whole system, for 5 minutes, saving your neck. That's wonderful. Do it for 30 years, thinking about mortgages or whatever, you're going to get sick. Like, increase your blood pressure for 2 minutes. That's great. Do it around the clock. You get stress-induced hypertension, mobilize energy chronically. You're more set for diabetes. You get reproductive problems. You mess up growth. You mess up tissue repair, all that sort of thing. So what winds up being most interesting to me is, so what happens when you are chronically soaking your brain in glucocorticoids? And the answer is, again, terrible stuff. Where things began, and this was like the late 70s when I was first doing this, the focus was this part of the brain, the hippocampus. Hippocampus, it does learning and memory for you. You want to have a hippocampus. It's blown out of the water in Alzheimer's disease. And sort of the field first focusing on the fact that lots of stress, lots of glucocorticoids, and you get a hippocampus that doesn't work as well. Synapses become less excitable, neurons shrivel up, neurons even die. The hippocampus as a whole will get smaller, will atrophy. And what's the consequence of that? Like, your memory is lousy, and we all knew that. Like, every time we did an all-nighter, and the next morning, like, we couldn't even remember what our name was to fill out the form on the final exam, their kind of thing. So stress messes with cognition. Then the field kind of shifted to another part of the brain next door, the amygdala, which is about fear and anxiety. And while stress is like causing your hippocampus to become totally sluggish and hypoactive, during stress, your amygdala works better than usual. And the neurons become more excitable and they grow new connections, and the amygdala gets bigger, and suddenly you're getting anxious about stuff that other people don't, or you're worrying about things that other people don't see as worrisome, and you're having trouble figuring out that you're finally safe. This is the connection between stress and anxiety disorders. Field then shifted to this whole system related to this neurotransmitter dopamine. And lots of people know dopamine, it's about pleasure, it's about reward. Cocaine releases dopamine in your dopamine reward systems. But it turns out actually dopamine is not so much about reward, it's about anticipation of reward. And it's about the work you're willing to do, the motivation to get the reward. What does chronic stress do? It depletes you of dopamine from that part of the brain. And suddenly, there's very little motivating you in terms of pleasure and anticipation. What do we got here? This is the link between stress and major depression. I guess the final outpost is this other part of the brain, the frontal cortex. And it's amazing. And I wish I hadn't spent 30 years on the hippocampus and had studied the frontal cortex instead. What does it do? It like makes you do hard stuff when that's the right thing to do, even though you're tempted to do. It does gratification postponement and long-term planning and impulse control and emotional regulation. And it is really, really important. And what does chronic stress do? Just like in the hippocampus, neurons don't work as well. They shrivel up. The frontal cortex gets, what's that explaining? Why you blurt out horribly like hurtful, stupid things when you're really stressed, or why you do stuff that's like you're going to regret for years to come, which seemed brilliant at the time. It's why judgment and executive function and impulse control goes down the tubes during stress. So we got what's overall like an awful picture of what's going on in the brain.
So you mentioned that with chronic stress, the hippocampal neurons shrivel, and anxiety, chronic anxiety often leads to depression. Now, my understanding, there are studies showing that hippocampus and maybe other brain regions get smaller with depression, but then when the person recovers from the depression through treatment, then those neurons that were shriveled previously, it seems like they still have the ability to grow back, which is I'm looking at this kind of optimistically though, but you know, so this chronic stress effects, at least with regards to depression, are reversible.
Well, I think this is one of those glasses half full, half empty. My personal bias is to see glasses as half empty. And the other way of framing that, yeah, chronic stress, your hippocampus is shrinking, you're killing neurons, all of that. Major depression, not, oh, disappointment and for a few days afterward you're, no, but major depression, crippling biological disorder that just destroys people. Major depression for years on end, and your hippocampus gets smaller. And the more severe your depression history, the longer, the more it shrinks, and the more your memory is screwed up. And then, aha, finally, thank God, they find a medication that helps you and or therapy that helps you, and things get better. And what you see is only partial recovery of the hippocampus. Major league depression long enough, and some of the dysfunction there, it never gets back to normal. Yeah. And you see the same thing with people with post-traumatic stress disorder, or people with chronic major anxiety disorders, things of that. The hippocampus really gets hammered, and it's got a capacity for recovery. Hooray, our brains can change. But if it's severe enough, it doesn't get you back to where you started.
As you know, over the years, my laboratory has done a lot of work on looking at the effects of caloric restriction and what's now called intermittent fasting on the brain. And, you know, it was one paradox in all this historically, and those kinds of studies is caloric restriction, intermittent fasting can extend lifespan, does good things for the body and brain. But there's a chronic elevation of the glucocorticoids. We did a study I had a graduate student, and this was with Jim Herman, who I don't know if you came across him, but
Sure, yeah.
when I was at Kentucky, and it was very simple, we had rats on intermittent fasting or not, and we let them go for a while, and we took out the hippocampus and we looked at levels of two proteins, one called the glucocorticoid receptor, and the other the mineralocorticoid receptor, MR. So GR and MR, those are at least two of the main ways that cells, including neurons, respond to the glucocorticoid. And what we found with intermittent fasting was not the same as what others had shown with chronic uncontrollable stress. In the latter case, bad stress, there's a decrease in MR levels and GR stays up. We found with intermittent fasting, it's the opposite. MR stays up and GR goes down. So maybe the ways in which neurons and other cells respond to these different stressors is different depending on the stressor that's activating this neuroendocrine system.
That's exactly the case. And what you then see is you want more MR. They mediate good things in the brain. You want less GR. They mediate the bad stuff. What we're seeing in a case like that is one of two things. Either like, yeah, glucocorticoid levels are elevated with caloric restriction. So if you're seeing beneficial effects in the brain, it's not because of these elevated glucocorticoid levels, it's despite them. Just imagine, and for years you had a colleague in Kentucky, Philip Landfield, who was showing that in fact glucocorticoid levels tend to rise with age, and if you prevent that, your aging hippocampus ages much better. The second possible explanation is in some ways even more interesting, which is, yeah, you had glucocorticoid levels elevated with caloric restriction. How much were they elevated? And this gets to this critical issue, like if you study stress for a living, whether you're like a developmental psychologist or a geriatric physician or anything in between, what's clear is your goal is not to cure us of stress. Because for one thing, we would drop dead the first time we run for a bus. But more importantly, we don't hate stress. We hate the wrong kind of stress. And when it's the right kind, we love it. We pay money to like be on a terrifying roller coaster. We crave stress that isn't too severe and doesn't last for too long.
Yeah.
And what do we call stress in this intermediate range? We call it stimulation. We call it like a fun challenge. We call it play. Get it right in the middle. And the jargon in the field winds up being, it's an inverted U. You've got an optimal glucocorticoid level, which is a little bit raised. And that's when your brain is like all alert. And that's great stuff. And too little, and the term for it is you're bored out of your mind, and too much and you're stressed, and too little, your brain doesn't get stimulated, all of that. We try to optimize the elevations of glucocorticoid levels, and it turns out if you get the elevation right in the range that you see with something like caloric restriction, your brain is releasing more dopamine. You're getting right in that range where it feels great. And what are the parameters of when stress is doing great things for you? Exactly you said, when it's intermittent and it's not too severe, and it doesn't go on for too long, like roller coaster rides are not 3 weeks long. And because after about 5 minutes, he would switch over to a stress range and get it right. And it's a great thing. And we hunger for it and are motivated to get just the right amount of stress because it feels great. And I think what caloric restriction is doing is, among other things, is it's fine tuning the system so it's right at that optimal point. So I think it's not despite those elevations. I think it's hand in hand with those elevations.
There's a protein that in the brain, it's called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And there's thousands, literally thousands of publications studying the effects of this protein because it's very important for learning and memory. And it's also been studied a lot with regards to stress. And glucocorticoids have been shown to decrease BDNF levels. BDNF promotes the growth of neurons, synapse formation. If you have too little BDNF, you get the shriveling of the neurons, and a lot of evidence that in depression, BDNF levels go down. Antidepressant treatments, whether it's electroconvulsive shock or serotonin, norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, they all increase BDNF levels. Exercise, which we haven't really mentioned at all, is a very good antidepressant. It has a dramatic effect in boosting the brain's BDNF levels. Yeah, so during exercise, these stress pathways you've been talking about, adrenaline, glucocorticoids, they go up, is that right, during exercise?
Dramatically.
And it's clearly a very good stress, not only for the body, but the brain.
Yeah, and here we have, like, wait a second, a lion is running after you and you're sprinting and the lion chases you for 26 miles. And this is like incredibly destructive to your body if you do that regularly. Run 26 miles for a marathon. And if you've got the right sort of lunatic mindset, which I believe you do and have been a long time runner, it feels great. What's this about? It's not that you're getting into the perfect optimal range. Your body has a massive stress response if you're like very heavily exercising. What's going on is this rule in physiology. If you get to boost the system up really high every now and then, regular exercise, what happens is the baseline levels get lower. And that's best known with like runners and heart rate. I mean, you get marathoners, I assume like your heart rate is about 50 beats a minute range or something. Like if you push the system to its max for the right amount of time, you lower the baseline so that everyday levels of glucocorticoids are lower and everyday blood pressure and heart rate and all of that. And when you look at how much are you paying in terms of like number of extra heartbeats during exercise and how much that saves you with a lowering the rest of the time, you get overall a vast benefit. So that's what conditioning is, so that not only are you able to like boost your maximal output, but your baseline gets quieter, and that's exactly what you want. And that's where some of those beneficial effects are coming from.
There's a term, hormesis, Hormesis, that I guess many people haven't heard of before, but it's just an umbrella term for something that when cells, organ systems, individuals are exposed to that environmental factor, they respond adaptively in ways that help them be more resilient, better cope with stress. So we've been talking about this hormesis concept, adaptive responses to environmental challenges. And during evolution, this is kind of a defining principle of evolution, that even you go back to single cell organisms, in order to survive, they had to be able to withstand harsh environments. So for example, things like iron and selenium, which most people think of, oh, this is a mineral in my multivitamin supplement, and I need this for my health. The iron for the red blood cells, the selenium it's like an antioxidant. But it turns out that those metals, iron and selenium, which were very common in these primordial soup, are very toxic at high levels. So the cells were selected for that were able not only to resist the toxic effects of these metals, but also they evolved ways to take advantage of those metals. So that's like going way back in evolution. But then if you move up into brain evolution, we talked about physical exercise briefly, about caloric restriction, intermittent fasting. These are evolutionarily important adaptations to environmental stress. The stress of food scarcity, the stress of things you've been talking about with baboons and being able to cope with social challenges. So could you kind of, if you have some ideas on, kind of elaborate on what I just said in terms of what you've seen in the baboons and what you know about primate evolution and adaptations to harsh environments?
Yeah, and I should say there's all this jargon stuff. Hormesis, you're from the hormesis camp, then there's the allostasis camp, then there's very elderly people who still hold on to homeostasis and interchangeable in a certain superficial way. But this notion of what your body really wants to do is to be in hormetic or allostatic or homeostatic balance. And what does that consist of? When there's nothing stressful going on, you want the lowest levels of everything you can imagine out there. And when something psychologically stressful comes along, you don't want to be fooled by it. Don't secrete glucocorticoids and adrenaline. It's not something real. It's just psychological nonsense. Something for real stressful comes along, you want the biggest, fastest explosion of the system turning on. And the second it's over with, you want it to go back to baseline as fast as possible. And that's exactly what you want out of the system. And that's the adaptive profile, and that's what you want, and it's wonderful and all of that. And then along come primates from like 20 million years ago who start being really bad at, in the face of psychological stress, not getting fooled by it. And it's this sort of evolutionary transition. Yeah, a lion is chasing you, you have a stress response. Yeah, you see a lion on the other side of the field, and you're not having to run for your life yet, but you secrete glucocorticoids. Ooh, you could secrete it in anticipation of like one of these major physical stressors, and that could be wonderful. But then you get to the point where every like giraffe out there looks like a lion to you, and you're activating the stress response in anticipation of physical stressors that aren't real. And that's what psychosocial stress is about. I mean, no matter how bad your job evaluation is, it's rare that you're going to be predated and your bones scattered and the savannah kind of thing. And suddenly primates develop this ability to take that anticipatory stress and do it long term, and do it when there's no stress there. And you got this 100-million-year-old system that's totally conserved, and this like ridiculous new invention in the last 10, 20 million years or so with primates that can socially stress each other nonstop. And you got a system that's just not very adaptive. And we and other primates pay the price for this. Most stress-related diseases are things that you get for being smart enough of a primate to get psychologically stressed all the time. Zebras don't get ulcers, fish don't get ulcers unless under very specialized circumstances. And you have the system that hasn't had enough time yet to evolve to be able to not fall for the psychological stress stuff.
And I guess, so it seems surprising, right, that this primate characteristic of chronic psychosocial stress, living in essentially societies where there's chronic, you would think that would be selected against, but selection doesn't seem to impact things that happen after reproductive age. And you talked about chronic diseases that are now killing us, some of those being accelerated and exacerbated by chronic psychosocial stress. And those diseases typically kill us after reproductive age. So do you think that's just kind of a simplistic explanation of why there hasn't been selection against this phenotype?
Well, it turns out there actually is selection. And the reason why it appeared with us is, thank God, we are rare among all sorts of species out there. Thank God that, like, our capacity to increase our Darwinian fitness and success doesn't end when the reproductive period ends. You could help relatives. For example, in hunter-gatherer societies, if you've got a maternal grandmother in the family unit, the kids have a higher likelihood of surviving. You have what's termed the grandmother effect, which is they help out. In hunter-gatherers and the Hadza people in Tanzania, the grandmothers contribute more calories to the family with their foraging than the father, the great hunter, does, because in hunter-gatherers, the hunters are mostly sitting around saying how amazing they are, while the women are the ones who are out getting most of the calories. Humans have selection for being cognitively intact after your reproductive years and being healthy, all of that. And what you see is, when you look at the major disorders of seeing stressful things that other people don't, you've just described major anxiety and major depression, they shorten your life expectancy. Depression is associated with a significantly increased risk of heart disease, metabolic disorders like type 2 diabetes and such. And they actually are having an effect on fitness, evolutionary fitness. So, okay, you come up with a prediction from that. So we're slowly having selection against all these phenotypes, these profiles of seeing stressors that other people don't. So the prediction is, go away and come back like 50,000 years from now, and all of the humans will be like the Dalai Lama in terms of like Zen calmness, because we're selecting against all of the people who have these hyperreactive stress responses. And that seems to be what happens, except every now and then something is different, something changes. And my family happened to get out of Europe at just the right time. So I always have the same metaphor that comes to me. If I was sitting in Berlin in 1930, I sure as hell hope I wouldn't have been sitting there saying, hey, political turmoil, it comes, it goes, these people with these armbands, it'll blow over. Like, I hope I would have been one of the ones who was saying, I'm getting out of here because this is not right. You have long periods of gradually selection against being hyperreactive to stress. And then along comes what's termed an evolutionary bottleneck, where 95% of the population is lost, and the 5% who make it are the canaries in the mine shafts who finally saw the real stressors before everybody else did. So you have this sort of scalloping thing, long gradual selection for hypoactivity, and then massive selection for all the hysterical neurotics, or the ones who make it through, and then long selection. And this is what's seeing. So I think, unfortunately, a million years from now, humans are going to be just as like crazy and anxiety prone and neurotic as they are now, because every now and then that's the thing that saves you.
Wow. Yeah, hopefully something will happen before a million years from now that'll be there. Maybe humans will revert to more like a bonobo kind of situation where everybody's happy and gets along.
Yeah, that they are a very different sort of primate. And yeah, we should all foster the inner bonobo in us. Yeah, evolution sent them in a very unique direction. As the jargon goes, chimps are from Mars, bonobos are from Venus. Chimps, scheming, violent, murder, cooperative killings, all of that, and bonobos, and they share 99% of their DNA, and they share 98.5% of it, each of those species, with us. We're not a chimp, we're not a bonobo, we're like this weird, confused mixture of the two. So yeah, bonobos, that would have been a nice path.
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago, I had Kay Holcamp on the podcast and talking about the hyenas, spotted hyenas, which are more like from Venus, I guess, because the females run the show. And I don't know if anybody's looked at stress responses in those, but what would you predict? Do you know if anyone's looked at that, and what would you predict?
Yeah, and it's wonderful that you had Kay on the show. For about a decade, her camp was about 4 miles upriver from my camp.
Oh my God.
And so, yeah, a neighbor out there. What she probably brought up was hyenas are like the weirdest mammals out there. Females are socially dominant to males, which is not totally unprecedented, but it's pretty rare. It's only like 5% of species that show that. But then female hyenas are bigger than male hyenas, and they're more muscular, and they're more aggressive, and they have higher levels of a type of testosterone than the males do. And female genitals are all masculinized. So like you look at like a hyena's private parts and you can't even tell what sex it is. They're what's termed pseudo-hermaphrodites. If you're like a fetal female hyena, you're getting soaked in these testosterone-like hormones from your mother. And you were born with somewhat of a masculinized profile. They're totally cool, weird animals. And females are terrorized by males. If you're like a baboon, 50% of baboon aggression is some idiot male who's in a bad mood and takes it out on an innocent bystander, which is usually a female. That doesn't happen with hyenas. Instead, it's female hyenas who are in a bad mood who take it out on these poor sniveling subordinate males.
Wow.
The males are stressed out of their minds. The females are nowhere near as much. So they're a really interesting reversal system. But like hyenas, they're very cool. They are not like your normal mom and pop hyena as to what like boys and girls look like and act like.
Over the last decades, as you know, there's been a lot of interest in what's called epigenetics, and essentially transmittal across generations of something. It could be a propensity to a certain behavior. It could be a propensity to depression. Now, could you briefly talk about epigenetics in the context of the stress? In other words, if a mother has been in a lot of stress during her life and during pregnancy, there's some evidence that it's more likely that her kid will be prone to kind of anxiety, stress, hyper-responsive phenotype.
And yeah, the first pass, it's great that you bring up epigenetics. First pass, you say, yeah, well, obviously you've got a depressive mother, you're brought up in a depressive environment. Yeah, that increases your likelihood of depression, but it's independent of that. Control for like how depressogenic your environment was growing up, and all things being equal, having spent your fetal life in the womb of somebody with elevated glucocorticoid levels because of depression, and your hippocampus and dopamine system and amygdala develop by the time you're born in a way that's already making you a little bit more vulnerable than average. And this is one of those epigenetic effects. It is possible to transmit these effects multi-generationally, and it's not changing genes. It's changing the activity of certain genes, the regulation of them. And for example, like prenatal, lots of prenatal stress, and you activate a profile of genes in your brain, in your metabolic system, all of that, that's prone towards saying, it's going to be a stressful world out there. Get ready, because it's always just around the corner, and you're always more prone towards just activating the stress response, because that made sense when you were a fetus, and it's preparative. And you do that for like the subsequent 80 years, and you're going to be more at risk for heart disease and diabetes and dementia and all sorts of stuff like that. So, whoa, what's going on when you were a fetus? That predicts it? Yeah. What's going on when, for example, you've spent the first 5 years of your life having another thing that does epigenetic changes to your brain? Spend the first 5 years of your life having bad luck and being in a family that's poor, low socioeconomic status. And by age 5, there's already epigenetic changes going on in your brain, so that your hippocampus and frontal cortex on the average is not developing as well as the kids who picked the right family to be born into. Like, socioeconomic status gets turned into lifelong differences in gene regulation in your brain. These are really powerful effects. They're not inevitable. They're just vulnerabilities. You're that much closer to the edge of the cliff.
And there's also quite a bit of evidence that kids born to parents with bad metabolic status, obesity, type 2 diabetes, are not only more prone to having obesity and developing type 2, but it adversely affects their brain. One, and I'm going to have a guest to talk about autism. There's quite a bit of evidence now that women with obesity during pregnancy or type 2 diabetes, there's a statistically significant increase in the chances that their child will have an autism spectrum disorder. And
I didn't know that.
yeah,
It's on some level that's not surprising, but that's amazing. Who is it who's going to be on talking about this?
I haven't decided yet. There's several people.
Okay, faux pas.
I actually wrote a review article with a student that we had in Trends in Neurosciences a couple of years ago on this. Anyway, but we'll leave it for that podcast. But kind of the bottom line is that, so the conventional explanation for why more kids are diagnosed on the spectrum is that these behaviors are recognized more now than they used to be. But it turns out that can't account for the dramatic increase in the last 40 years.
Yep.
And it is interesting that increase actually parallels our lags behind just a little bit, the increase in maternal obesity. And then animal data support all this. There's animal models and so on. So getting back to the future of our brains, there's many things. This epigenetic changes, I think, is a bad indication. There's increased obesity. People are increasingly under a lot of stress. There's increased incidence of anxiety disorders, depression. And if propensity to these is propagated across generations, what's gonna stop that propagation? Now, I guess, it could be a war or something, but I don't know.
Well, what you're tapping into are like two incredibly interesting points, which initially seem contradictory. Some of these early life effects of adversity or stress or deprivation, or winding up in the great, stimulating, loving, secure environment, whatever, some of these epigenetic effects can not only last your whole lifetime, but can be multi-generational. My God, you're screwed, it's inevitable. So that is one seeming truth. And that's seemingly running head on into another truth, which is your brain is enormously malleable throughout your lifetime. Neuroplasticity, elderly people's brains change in response to experience. How do these pieces fit together? And in a sort of picture of, early experience messes with your brain. It's long lasting. It could be lifelong, but get the right interventions, it could change. And as a key rule, the longer you wait, the more of an uphill battle it's going to be. And thus, back in the 60s, the Head Start program, during the Johnson Great Society stuff, take kids from, underprivileged environments and start getting them more stimulated and more focused, starting in kindergarten. Do it then instead of when they're 30 years old. It's going to be easier to change the trajectory of stuff. So brains can change. The longer you wait, though, the more they're set in their ways, and the more likely you are to thus see multi-generational consequences.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, yes, I forgot one thing. Let's get back to the adverse effects of chronic glucocorticoids on the brain, chronic elevation. Now, I remember one of the first times I talked to you, we collaborated a little bit. Why don't you talk about glucocorticoids and stroke, and my understanding is how your findings and kind of pressuring neurologists may have changed the thinking on actually administering dexamethasone to someone who's had a stroke. And then to talk a little bit about Alzheimer's, get it in a little bit to what's happening in the neurons and how glucocorticoids may exacerbate that.
Well, all of that's the case, and us getting to collaborate back when is one of my points of pride, that we got to publish together in our glucocorticoid worlds. And you're now the expert on caloric restriction, but at an earlier time you were the world's expert on the damaging effects of glutamate, this neurotransmitter in the brain. It turns out part of how glucocorticoids mess with the brain is they worsen the glucocorticoid system. So that's where our really fun collaborations came from. What you see is, big surprise, if you've just had a stroke, if you've just had a grand mal seizure, if you've just had a concussive head trauma, you secrete tons of glucocorticoids. In the hours after a stroke, you see among the highest levels of glucocorticoids you will ever see in anybody's bloodstream. So what have we learned from this last hour? That's not a good thing, because they're going to be messing with your neurons at exactly the time they're the most screwed up and traumatized and vulnerable and all of that. And that seems like a no-brainer and totally straightforward. The stress response in the aftermath of one of these neurological disasters adds to the damage. And starting in the early 80s, we were showing, in rats, block their glucocorticoid secretion right after they have had a stroke, and you get less damage. Part of the dead neurons that you see after these insults are due not just to the insult, but the fact that the insult causes this prolonged massive stress response. Okay, so that's totally straightforward. Just get rid of glucocorticoids in the aftermath of one of these insults. Meanwhile, down the hall are your stroke neurology people. And what do? A huge percentage of the time when somebody comes in who's just had a stroke or a concussive head injury, they give you synthetic glucocorticoids. What's that about? And that's to deal with what's one of the most immediate consequences of one of those insults, which is brain swelling, brain inflammation. Glucocorticoids are anti-inflammatories. You take cortisol, hydrocortisone for your swollen knee kind of stuff. They decrease the brain inflammation. So they're great for saving you from the brain swelling right after an insult. However, they are pounding those neurons at their worst possible, most vulnerable time. And what you see is like glucocorticoid treatment post ischemia, it decreases the brain swelling complications, but it worsens the overall outcome. And what the literature showed was that all along, you don't want to use steroidal anti-inflammatories like glucocorticoids. They're steroids. You want to use non-steroidals. And I don't know, I spent how many years, like you go and give a talk in a neurology department and you're telling all the stroke people, don't give them glucocorticoids post-stroke, use one of the alternatives because you're making things worse. And here's the data. And like inevitably, like these neurologists would come in afterward and saying, you know, I did my residency at the Mass General in 1903, and we've been like giving post-stroke glucocorticoids ever since to reverse the edema. It's been, I don't know, you've had a similar experience in terms of your work impacting translational, actually clinical medicine, and it's a very different world. And it's one that is slow to change, and it is built on a great amount of folk wisdom and folk mythology at times, and often intuition, and stuff moves slowly there because it's important stuff. Yeah, it's taken a long time and a lot of big multi-center type studies to suggest that post-stroke glucocorticoids are not a clever thing to be like raising the levels of in someone.
Yeah. Okay, I hear your dog is, was that a dog or a bird?
You have amazing ears. That was actually a clock. We have a National Geographic clock, which on the hour makes a different animal sound, which was like for our kids growing up. And the clock got dropped about 15 years ago and something was out of whack. So it's off on the hours. So that chirping just now was for the leopards. You get the elephants growling. It's just sort of out of whack with that. But it's always like you get somebody coming over visiting, and all of us are completely habituated to it, including the dogs, that like every hour or so suddenly there's like a dolphin sound in the house, and you see everybody else reacting, and you could see they're puzzled why we don't seem to have noticed that there was just this elephant trumpeting thing. And because we're habituated, so we just have this background. Every hour we hear some animal sound, and it's coming out of the wrong animal according to the picture showing at the time on the clock. So we've totally
is it 12 different animals and the same animal, or is it random?
Yes, no, it's 12 different animals, and the little hand points to which animal it is. So for the first 5 years, we could tell our kids that's what a lion sounds like, that's what a hyena sounds like. And then the clock got screwed up. And ever since we were doing, that's not what a lion sounds like. Lions don't chirp. Here's when it's pointing to the flamingos, that's when it sounds like a lion. So
right. Like, so when you hear the elephant sound, you know that it's whatever, 2 o'clock.
Exactly. Even though the clock doesn't quite say that. So not surprisingly, our kids have not grown up to be zoologists because we totally messed them up with that and the stupid clock. But yes, that was the chirping in the background.
I would point listeners to a number of places. Several books. The most recent book that Robert's written for general audience is Behave. Is that right?
Yeah.
And I'm not going to talk about that because it's easy for people to find the book. It's easy for people to find Robert being interviewed about the things he talks about and that, people at their best and worst. And yeah, Robert's easy to find. There aren't too many, there aren't a lot of Sapolskys, are there?
Very few. We're all vaguely related. There's one guy, an MIT professor, who's the world's expert on Polaris submarine warfare, which was kind of interesting to bump into. But yeah, there's not a whole lot of us. As it turns out, all of us had the same different name from what we have now when the folks came through Ellis Island, and in all the cases, somebody or other there filling out the form decided to clean up, get rid of some of the consonants. But yeah, there's not a whole lot of us.
So Robert, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I wish we could spend more time talking. I always enjoy talking with you. I think one of our most interesting experiences when I invited you to come to University of Kentucky and give a talk. I think it must have been 1994, because when you got to the airport, Air Force One was just coming in, and it was an election year. So Bill Clinton was in it. And then I drove you back. And when we got back, there was all these bleachers put up. And Robert with his, I guess, well-groomed primate facial hair. He was worried that he might get noticed, and the law enforcement might think he was some crazy person.
Well, there was that worry, but you're right. I was delayed hours getting out of there, and the campus was totally crazy. And you and I were sitting there saying, why are all these roads blocked off here? What? Okay, so your lab, okay, we'll make a left here instead. That's right, Bill Clinton. It was in October of 94 or 93 or so. And yeah, that was an interesting day to be in Kentucky. We were both very puzzled till it became clear. That was great.
Okay, Robert, it's great to talk to you. Take care, and look forward to seeing what you're working on now come out in print. Do you want to say anything about that or not?
Nah, I've got this book that was supposed to be done a year ago and it's not done yet. So I should probably be on the prudent side and like lay low with that. But thanks, Mark. This was really fun. You're an amazing scientist. Seeing that you're a great interviewer also is like not surprising, but
well,
thanks
my main goal now is to be able to communicate as well as you do.
Well, thanks.
Okay.
Good. Take care, Mark.
Okay. Bye.